Hello, everyone. I'm Shuja Nawaz, and it's my distinct pleasure and honor to begin a new series of conversations with authors with Ayad Akhtar, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning uh, playwright and a novelist. He has written two novels, American Dervish, that came out many years ago, 2012, and then now Homeland Elegies, his latest book that has been hailed as the American masterpiece. And we hope to talk with him about not just his book, but his writing in general, because he has been one of the most prolific authors in recent memory. Turns out almost every year or two, he has a new play or something new to add. And in addition to his plays and books, he is also a screenwriter. So he has written a well-known um, film script for which he received a nomination for an award, and his plays have also received a number of awards. The uh, latest news from his side is that he has now been nominated to be the next president of PEN America. He'll be succeeding the novelist Jennifer Egan. I don't know exactly when that'll be, but maybe he can tell us. Um, Ayad normally lives in New York City. I say normally because these are not normal times, and I assume that he is now a refugee somewhere in the wilds of upstate New York. So welcome, Ayad.
Thank you, Shuja. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you to everybody who's joined us for this conversation.
Thank you. And let me start off by having you read a section from your
Sure.
book,
hmm
which I think reflects the times that we're living in. Your book is almost as if it was taken from today's headlines. So,
with Trump, the patient, no less.
so there's a character in the book called Mike Jacobs, who is a Hollywood agent. He's unusual in the sense that he's an African American Hollywood agent, and you have a conversation with him. And if you wouldn't mind reading from that
Sure.
section.
He basically, I, the narrator, named Ayad Akhtar, who has many of the facts of my life and my name in the book, have dinner with Mike in May of 2016 when he predicts that Donald Trump is going to be the next president, contrary to what most seem to think. And I find it absurd. And then he goes on to explain what this is all about. And he ends with this. This is not him speaking. I'm paraphrasing for him. Obama's victory had turned out to be little more than symbolic, only hastening our nation's long collapse into corporate autocracy. And his failures had raised the stakes immeasurably. Most Americans couldn't cobble together a week's expenses in case of an emergency. They had good reason to be scared and angry. They felt betrayed and wanted to destroy something. The national mood was Hobbesian, nasty, brutish, nihilistic, and no one embodied all this better than Donald Trump. Trump was no aberration or idiosyncrasy, as Mike saw it, but a reflection, a human mirror in which to see all we'd allowed ourselves to become. Sure, you could read the man for metaphors, an unapologetically racist real estate magnate embodying the rise of white property rights, a self absorbed idiot epitomizing the rampant social obsession and narcissism that was making us all stupider by the day, greed and corruption so naked and endemic it could only be made sense of as the outsized expression of our own deepest desires. Yes, you could read the man as if he were a symbol to be deciphered, but Mike thought it was much simpler than all that. Trump had just felt the national mood, and his particular genius was a need for attention so craven, so unrelenting, he was willing to don any and every shade of our moment's ugliness. Consequences be damned.
I think that accurately captures not only your style, but your ability to convey so much in such a compact form. Um, your first novel was American Dervish, and that had a younger protagonist. Uh, it appears almost as if the same protagonist has now become
Grown
old.
up. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, in between these were a series of very successful plays that you produced and that have won you accolades. Um, my favorite is The Invisible Hand, but the Pulitzer Prize went to Disgraced, and then I'm particularly intrigued by the other plays also. So uh, people should be reading those and watching them on the stage when things go back to normal. How did you decide to do this book? Was there some kind of an elevator pitch that you made to your agent or to your publisher? And what was it?
I didn't have an elevator pitch. I had initially wanted to write a much shorter novel. I wanted to write a book about, late in my father's career, very similar to the father in the book. There was a malpractice lawsuit that my father went through in western Wisconsin in the rural reaches of the state. And I had done a lot of research. I had all the court transcripts, and I'd spoken to all the lawyers, and I had wanted to write a short book about a doctor at the end of his career, an immigrant doctor from Pakistan who has he goes through this case, and it's kind of a referendum on his belonging in America. And it was a much simpler book than this that I was planning to write. Of course, that idea did get folded into this book, but I started to write it, and it wasn't working. That was the pitch I had made to my agent and my editor. I said I was going to write this book about the court case and all of that kind of reckoning with the end of a person's career and their life in America. But it wasn't working. As I've often said, when speaking about the book, I was going through a really intense emotional combination of things. My mother had passed away. My father was showing very significant signs of decline, the sort of severe late stage alcoholism that I track in the book, with to some comedic effect, was really taking a toll on him and on me and my brother. And Donald Trump's election and the collapse of the politics, not only nationally but locally in Wisconsin, supportive of this in the book, because I think some of the things that have happened nationally, all of that just created this intense need to somehow address what was happening.
Good.
And so at the end of the day, what ended up, yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. So at the end of the day, I don't really know what accounted for the inspiration, that's sort of the igniting spark that set all of this kindling into set it ablaze. I read a poem. This is a story that I've told a few times. I read a poem by Leopardi, an Italian poet, who had written a poem called "To Italy," and in the poem, he's addressing his fellow Italians and trying to remind them of what they were and how far they'd fallen. And I remember thinking, would it be possible to write a book or to have a voice that addressed the American nation, my fellow citizens? Could I summon a voice that would unify, if you will, that American experience? And it's a very grandiose thought, but I woke up the next morning after having that thought, and the first sentence of this book was already sort of forming itself. So I just followed the inspiration for about 11 months. I would write for 2 weeks, then I would stop exhausted, then I would start again, on and off. I wrote for about 6 months out of those 11 months. And at the end of that time, I had this book, and I had not predicted it. And I was scared when I showed it to my agent and my editor, because it's really a very unusual book in many ways.
It is, and it is a multi-layered book, if I may say so, because there are so many themes, and some, of course, are continued from your plays and from your earlier novel, the question of assimilation, belonging, exile, father and son or mother and daughter conflicts. Do we belong here? But in many ways, as you describe it, you have now produced the American novel for this time. And I think that is really what is resonating with readers. So the question is, did you go back to what you had done before and try to craft a continuum, or did that just appear naturally?
Thank you for that question. I think that I was startled when I finished the book after that 11-month period at the coherency of the narrative. That is to say, it's of course fractured, and I moved from essay into history, and then to analysis, and then to fiction, and sort of family drama, and long dialogue scenes, and everything is always shifting. But at the end of the day, the picture that the book portrays of America, a country divided between rural and urban, between heartland and coast, between economic classes, between racial divides, and a nation whose psyche was still fixated consciously and unconsciously on the wound of 9/11. And the ways in which 9/11, I think, is behind so much of what has happened since, whether it's the collapse of the world order with the American sort of center no longer holding, or whether it's the widespread divisions and kind of, I think there is a case to be made that the violence unleashed on 9/11 is still unfolding and reverberating, not only through the world, but in our own society. So at the end of the day, again, when I finished the book, which I had, I didn't exactly know how it was coming to pass. I was writing into the present. I didn't know how it was going to end. And then once it did end, I sort of read it all and realized there was a startling coherency to all of this that didn't necessarily need revising. There was a little bit of revising, but I think ultimately speaks to the thing that you're asking about, which is I've been writing about all of these things in different ways for quite some time. And in a way, I think all that I did, or all that was that was allowed to happen for whatever reason that I can't explain, is it all came together as like one river. All these various tributaries just flowed into a single thing, and that's what the book ended up becoming. Oh, and I want to say one thing about, it was very clear to me that as a Muslim, Pakistani American artist, whatever, I get hounded by this question of identity constantly. Just that the notion of identity politics being so central to what everybody is thinking about these days, and I think sometimes thinking too much about. But it seemed to me impossible that I couldn't write this book without accounting for the history of my family and the history that meant I carried in me. And that history was, of course, a history of Pakistan. And so to some extent, I had to cover that ground, even though I was not writing about Pakistan.
A basic question that you raised in your first novel, and that comes up in Disgraced also, is this question of, how do Muslims exist, or how do they thrive in an American society? And that seems to be an issue that the character in this book faces also, because they are treated differently. And I just want you to read a small section where there's an exchange between an agent of the SEC who is investigating as to how you've made so much money, and that it must be insider trading, and you must have done something wrong. And then there's this exchange, which encapsulate this issue rather beautifully, I thought.
Do you remember where that section, what sentence that started with?
Page 169.
Yeah.
It's Agent Zakiya Watkins.
Yeah.
If you can start from where Zakiya sat down at the table again.
Okay.
And then ends with, you didn't hear it from me.
Zakiya sat down at the table. Okay, great. Zakiya sat down at the table again. Should I give a little bit of context, a little bit more context?
Where did it occur, and what was she looking at in your sparse apartment?
Yeah. So in the book, there are many, many storylines that unfold. And one of the storylines is the sort of rise of this narrator, Ayad Akhtar, and how he starts to become successful. And when he becomes successful and wins a Pulitzer, he gets invited to join a foundation. And this foundation is run by a hedge fund manager by the name of Riaz Rind, whose philanthropic organization is about changing the conversation about Islam in America. And he's doing a lot of work to be an advocate for Muslim voices and whatnot. And so the narrator kind of gets involved with this. He has some misgivings about some of it. Thinks some of it's a little too much like public relations, but he likes the lifestyle. He likes being associated so closely with the rich and famous, or the power, really the powerful. He likes access to power, to understand it a little bit better, and all of that. And then what ends up happening is that when the narrator's mother dies and leaves him some money, he doesn't know what to do with it. And his friend, Riaz Rin, this guy who runs the hedge fund, decides, he says, I'll invest it for you. And he puts it into a new outfit that Riaz is starting, and is pre-IPO. And then, when the IPO happens, and then when the stock rises, ultimately this $300,000 inheritance turns into, $2.5 million. And then knock, knock, knock at the door about a year later, and an agent from the SEC shows up and says, well, there's some funny business that was going on with this guy, Riaz Rin. So they have this long conversation, and then the section you want me to read is this one. Zakia sat down at the table again, and instead of asking me more questions now, laid out the class action complaint as she understood it. The SEC was looking into it too, she said, because Riaz's company had taken out short positions against the debt they'd sold to municipalities. He's selling debt to municipalities that are refusing to open mosques in their communities. When that debt defaulted, Riaz made a killing. All that said, she added, it still wasn't clear if any laws had been broken. By now, I felt comfortable enough to hazard a comment. I don't expect many SEC agents would have appreciated. I mean, honestly, what you're describing doesn't really sound any worse than what Goldman was doing in 2010, I said. Your friends know Goldman Sachs, Zakia responded. That he's not. Wrong color, she said as she stood, buttoning her blazer, and praying to the wrong God. But you didn't hear it from me.
That says volumes about the state of Muslims, and and as you guessed, that she probably was a Muslim, the SEC agent. Another theme that we've mentioned and that comes across very powerfully is that of exile and assimilation. And I'm wondering, you've mentioned Salman Rushdie. Salman Rushdie has given you an incredibly lavish blurb for your book. He says it's unputdownable, not a word that I would have associated with Salman, but this is his description of your work. In his own Satanic Verses, there's a chapter 4, where there's a Khomeini-like character, and it's one of the best essays on exile. Now, clearly, exile is something that you are thinking about all the time. And your way of presenting it is a bit different from anyone else that I've read recently, particularly since you don't have the traditional father figure depicted in this. You don't have the highly radicalized Muslim father figure. You have the opposite of that in this book. So could you talk a bit about how you look at exile and the question of belonging?
I in the book, the father figure, who is largely inspired by my father, is somebody who really espouses a kind of American belonging, or at least aspires to want to belong in America. And his vision of America is admittedly somewhat superficial, in the sense that I think he takes American opportunity and can do American spirit, a little bit too on face value. But anyway, he becomes a very successful doctor, or is a very successful doctor, and sings America's praises in many ways, and doesn't like that his wife, who is largely inspired by my mother, really doesn't still understand why it is that they're in this country, and most of the stuff that she sort of wishes she doesn't really see in what she gained by being here, a compensation for the things that she left behind. She misses home a lot. So between those two poles of, which ultimately become a kind of, on the one hand, espousing an American individualism fueled by debt, released from consequences, inspired by Donald Trump, and on the other hand, a kind of anti-Americanism that at moments seems to even flirt with a kind of support, at least ideologically, for bin Laden. And so between those two poles is the narrator's experience of America. And he himself, in a pre 9/11 America, doesn't feel the question of belonging to be all that big a deal, but post 9/11 does feel it that way and feels that there's no access. I myself would not have been able to write this book if I hadn't gotten to a point where I didn't ultimately care anymore. That is to say that there's a relaxation in recognizing that I may never belong, and that's okay, and that there are some forms of belonging that I have and others that I don't, and being an outsider, no matter what culture I'm in, is maybe a very good position for an artist to be in. But I had to come to peace with that, if you will, psychologically, and not feel that. And that happened. And so I think in a weird way, I'm able to explore all of these possibilities. You know, Riaz Rind believes he's going to become American. He'll feel American when he makes $1 billion. And there's an uncle in the book named Shafat who tries to solve the question of belonging by becoming a Christian. And then, you know, there's his girlfriend, the narrator's girlfriend, Asha, Texas-born, who ultimately solves her American dilemma by arranging her own marriage to, you know, a Pakistani doctor. So, you know, everybody's trying to solve that question, and there's no solution. Everybody finds their own way, and none of the solutions ultimately work, but they're all good enough, if you will. It's like life.
This is why I use the word multi-layered to describe this novel. Now, Ayad, I could go on asking you many more questions and having you comment on so many aspects of this wonderful piece of writing, but I do want to introduce three other colleagues and friends who have agreed to join this conversation, and I should have introduced them at the outset, but let me do that now. The first one is Nuchi Courier. She's the president of the Women's National Democratic Club in Washington, D.C. The second is a former diplomat from Pakistan, Javed Amer, who himself is an author and an essayist and continues to write and read voraciously. Very impressed by his output. And then there's Shamaila Chaudhry, who comes to us from the Obama administration and now is the head of the American Pakistan Foundation. So I'm going to yield the floor first to Nuchi and see if she would like to comment or ask you a question. Nuchi, over to you.
So, Ayad, it's wonderful to meet you again. I was very interested in your first chapter and your last chapter, where Mary Maroney is bookending your entire story.
Yeah.
So you start off with her and you end with her. And when you start out with her, she is the person who is actually taking you on this journey of self-discovery. And then and you who have been unquestioningly American, the way you've been raised, suddenly start to question certain premises. And then right at the end, when you appear to be disillusioned, Mary Maroney is the one who is expressing hope. So I was wondering why you chose Mary to highlight that.
Mary Maroney, of course, the name Maroney referring to the Mormon angel Moroni. Mary is inspired largely by a teacher that I had whose name was Mary Capello, in college, and who was very brilliant and who really was the first person to open my eyes to the ways that literature spoke to the contemporary political realities, that we would read Melville or Emerson, or we would read, members of the American Renaissance and the themes, Whitman, for example, and the themes that those writers were writing about and the world that those writers were writing about were substantially had a lot to do with the world that we were living in, and the tools that she would use to make sense of those thinkers and those writers were tools that we would use in class to make sense of the world that we lived in. She, I found her so amazing because she treated me like an equal. I was a 19-year-old. I had no right to be treated as an equal, but she did. And you know, it's a wonderful thing when teachers are so good and they're also generous. You know, it reminds me of something that Rumi once said, which is that you can achieve a higher level than the level you think your master has by truly believing in your master, even if your master is a false master. So you can achieve a higher level than the level you think your master has just by believing in him. And I experienced that with Mary, is that, you know, her generosity made me believe in myself. And so the book is an homage to her as well.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for the question.
We're going to go to Javed and have him ask his question. Let's see if we can bring him on. While we're waiting for Javed, maybe we can move on to Shamila, because there may be some connection issues there. So Shamila, would you like to ask your question?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shuja. Thank you, Ayad. You've written something so beautiful and so painful to read, because I think so many of us can relate to this, undoubtedly. There's so many lived experiences that you know, all of us share, that you've written so eloquently about. And I have a question and a comment related to that. So my question is, what are you asking of us, those of us that can relate to this story that you've shared? A lot of the experiences I had, like, exactly to the T, the discussion of, you know, the satanic verses. My mom saw it on my desk and she's like, what is that doing there? Right? So, and so my comment related to that is, I think what you've captured, which is really hard to do, is the inherent politicalness or political nature of our lives as immigrants, as Pakistanis, as people of color, post 9/11, pre 9/11. And, you know, we are everything except the individual, right? And so the conclusion I reached was, we have more identity than you can ever imagine or want. And so what do we do with that realization that you've put together so wonderfully? What happens to us now? Because realizing that, and realizing so explicitly that we don't just get to be an individual, a regular person. What do we do with that knowledge in hand? How do we use it? Or do we use it at all? Is the advice just to relax, as you have relaxed as the writer?
Shamila, thank you. You're going to make me cry. That was such a beautiful comment about your experience of the book. Yeah, I think it's so spot on what you're saying about denied individuality, you know, denied our individualness. You know, what I didn't say to Shuja at the top of this talk was that as I was writing that early, very short version of my dad's story as a novel, the reason I had to give up was because I just wanted to write a novel about an older man who, yes, was an immigrant, but who was struggling through some really profound emotional existential issues that ultimately did not have to do with identity. It had to do with his own interior life, things left undealt with, right? But the second every time I was writing this out, you know, doctor in Western Wisconsin and a jury of his white, it became political. Every single time it became political, no matter what way I twisted it. And so that was when I sort of gave up and realized, okay, I don't know what I'm going to do here. I'm going to write freely. And in writing freely, I'm going to try to lay claim to the individual in the midst of all of this politics, because I can't avoid the politics. I can't avoid a reader reading this and thinking, oh, those Muslims are, I'm not writing about Muslims. I'm not writing about Pakistanis. I'm writing about the people I know that happen to be Pakistani. They happen to be Muslim. So what? It shouldn't be that big a deal. But it turns out, as you said, it is. And it is because of American foreign policy. It is because of many centuries of ideology. It is for all kinds of reasons that turn out to be fascinating to write about. And in a way, yeah, it was a kind of freedom to say, okay, I'm going to accept the politics here and I don't care. But I'm also going to foreground the individual. I'm going to foreground the sex. I'm going to foreground love. I'm going to foreground narcissism. I'm going to foreground the pursuit of success. I'm going to foreground interiority, a relationship with the mother. I'm going to foreground a father-son dynamic that is probably one many people have, irrespective of their identity. You know, so in a way, I think maybe the book is trying to do something literature has done for me in my life, which is to create a zone or a ground of emotion, thought, and experience that helps us, I don't know, it helps me situate myself in the world. And so to hear you say what you're saying about the book having that effect on you is very, very moving to me. Really makes me want to cry. So
Thank
I
you.
want you to do that, Ayad. Thank you. Let's move on in a slightly different direction to talk a little bit about your craft.
Sure.
There's a question from someone in the audience named Ali Arsalan Pasha, and he says, I would love to hear Ayad's advice to aspiring novelists like myself who have completed their first draft to go on from here and becoming a published author. I guess that's a question you probably have been asked a number of times.
Yeah, I think it's, it's always hard. It takes years. And I mean, I can just tell you my story. I wrote a short novel in my early 20s that was, god awful. I thought it was incredible, but nobody could read it. And then I wrote a very long novel in my late 20s and early 30s, which was almost as bad, maybe a little bit better. Hundreds and hundreds of pages, and I couldn't get anybody to read that or certainly publish it. And then I wrote American Dervish. I wrote a draft of American Dervish. That was really my third novel. And find an agents. I mean, 7 agents, many of whom said, this is a wonderful book. We really love it, but we don't see a market for it, so we're not going to take it on. So it was a year and a half, and each of those agents had something interesting to say about how it could be better. And so I took the notes. And what was a 500-page manuscript came down to 345 pages. And eventually I landed on an agent who loved it. And then it, in 2010, was the largest sale of debut fiction in New York City. But that story, people hear that and they, oh, wow, he's so successful. There was 15, 20 years before that of struggle. So I guess what I'd say is it's great. Congratulations, you have a draft done. That's amazing. Show it to people who you believe you trust and who can help you make it better, and start sharing it with people who can help you get published. It's a long process, and don't give up. It took me a long time. I've been wanting to be a writer since I was 15, and I didn't really break through until I was in my late 30s. So 23 years, really.
Thank you. I think that applies not just to fiction, but also to nonfiction, and it resembles my own story considerably. Let's talk a little bit more about the way you approach your craft. An interesting aspect of your book is you appear to share your own writing techniques. The protagonist is constantly taking notes. His dad resents the fact that every night he sits down and writes down everything that happened during the day. And so the question that comes to mind is, how did you think about having this novel within a novel become a method of conveying behind the scenes what was going on?
Right. It was clear to me that one of the dynamics of the book was going to be constantly folding the illusion that the book is real and really happening, that the composition of it is happening in real time, that I needed to fold a whole level of the narrative in that way. And so process and reflection on story structure and how stories work and all of that sort of stuff becomes part of the book, because I want the reader to be engaging. So that's really, in some cases, I think my narrator, who, as we know, has my name in many of the facts of my life, but is not me, he is a much more diligent writer than I am. I'm not always as diligent as he is. Sometimes I am, but I'm not always as diligent as he is. And so, for example, one of the things the examples that I use, with regards to him taking notes, the primary purpose of including that in the book was to be able to set up a situation where the father could find those notes. So then the father could ask and could realize that his son is writing about him, And then the father could say, I hope you write some nice things about me, in a book where we see that the son is writing some not so nice things about his father. And so that doubling of the vision creates a kind of space or volume. And that volume creates an illusion of life, that one has the sense that something real is happening because there's a movement between opposites inside this space. So that's what I'm always looking for on a craft level. I'm looking for opportunities to create volume inside the story that is going to begin to create an emotional flow that feels like life.
I know that you've studied film, and I think I shared with you some early comment about how this reminded me of Truffaut's film Night for Day, which was about the making of a film.
Yeah, right.
It
I love that movie.
One thing into the other.
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting comparison. I think we may have Javed Amer now on board. So if Javed is ready, maybe we can go to him and have him ask his question.
He's still.
I think technology.
Hello.
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 Yes, please turn
Hello?
your camera on. And
Turn your camera
ask
on,
your
Javed.
question.
Camera on.
My camera is on. I think I can.
Ask him if they can.
Can you hear me? We could let us do it without the
Yes,
without the
yes.
camera.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, because I'm sorry. I've been struggling with this and I couldn't get through. But anyway, yeah, it's wonderful to see you. At least you can't see me, but I can see you.
Yes.
And I recall very vividly when you wrote your first novel, The American Dervish, and you were in Politics and Prose. We had a very nice discussion on Islam in America.
Mm.
And by the way, now this whole book, I have lived here in the United States also about 42 years. So I am kind of representative of your father's generation.
Yeah.
But of course, I'm the first generation American. Now, the main question, I had several questions. It's a fantastic book. I mean, I've been spellbound by it for about a week. I've read it very slowly and thoroughly enjoyed it. So, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Can hear you loud and clear. Thank you for those comments, Javed. Yes. What's the question?
Wonderful. Yeah, the question is that I see a tremendous resemblance to Philip Roth's work. Which I think in the novel or probably in one of your interviews, you said that you were greatly influenced.
Yes.
For example, his American Pastoral, this book is more or less telling the same story in a different context.
Sure.
This widening of the American literary canon, which I think you've done it extremely well, that you brought in the Pakistani Muslim experience into the American landscape, which is resembling, of course, Philip Roth's work, that he brought the Jewish experience
Yes.
into the American literary canon.
Yeah.
So, how did you blend this? I mean, how much of an influence was that? I think you also mentioned Saul Bellow in the same context. So this is pretty remarkable, because I don't think there's any other novelist, as far as I have read, of your heritage, who has done this so successful.
Right. Thank you, Javed, for that question. That's a very perceptive series of reflections about my influences. That's right. I mean, I am deeply inspired by Philip Roth and by Saul Bellow. I started reading them in my early 20s. And I felt immediately the kinship. I felt that there was some continuity of the kinds of preoccupations of a religious identity that was different from the mainstream American sort of Christian inflected identity. And of course, we share so much with the Jewish faith and the Jewish sort of mindset. And so there was a kind of overlap that was natural and the other thing that fascinated me was, how were these writers and these comics, I mean, just a lot of the comics of that generation as well, how were they making a place for themselves in the American mainstream to the point where their idioms, which were clearly ethnic and clearly different and clearly Eastern European or clearly inspired by somewhere else, became dominant modes of comedy and narrative in American life. And so observe, the best Christmas songs are written by Jews who don't celebrate Christmas. So how did that happen? So I've spent my whole career thinking about that. And in particular with this book, I think Philip Roth's late trilogy, which you identified, American Pastoral, and then I Married a Communist, and finally The Human Stain, that was the real inspiration for this book, because at root, I think those books are about the social construction of the self. That is to say, that the society creates the self, that the individual experience that Shamila was talking about earlier is substantially woven from the strands of social discourse and social practice. And it's a very hard thing to get your finger on as a writer. And Philip Roth in those late works does such a brilliant job of doing so. And in a way, I knew that one of the things I wanted to do was to speak to and elucidate and dramatize the way American society's changes over the last 40 years have created a kind of social text from which we as Americans, not just Muslim Americans, but all Americans, have been forming ourselves, if you will. And Plato has a wonderful metaphor where he talks about the city as, in the Republic, he says the city is the metaphor for the soul. And in a way, it's because the city creates the soul. They're interchangeable. So if that's the case, what does it mean that the American city, the polis, has become what it has become? What are the implications on the individual? That was the subject of the book at the end of the day. And it's, of course, Philip Roth's great theme.
Thank you, Ayad. It's quite clear that you're capturing American culture, and culture, by its very definition, has to be something that is live, is constantly changing and evolving. Now, one of the criticisms that you might face from a Pakistani audience, and you may already have heard about these, is one that, here you are, a Pakistani American, making fun of your heritage, showing the unsavory aspects of Pakistani immigrants and their behavior in America, and thereby further strengthening the caricature that many Americans have of immigrants from South Asia, particularly from Pakistan, and particularly in today's Trumpian America of Muslim immigrants. So how do you respond to them as to why you've done what you've done with this book?
Thank you for that, Shuja. You thank you for that question. Thank you for the kind version of that question, which allows me space to answer it. I don't really have a response other than to say that as an artist, I am interested in the entire picture, and that as a comic novelist, I'm interested in that which which makes the audience laugh, and that I don't see laughing at and laughing with to be the same things. I think sometimes some of my colleagues and my friends and my family think that the audiences and the readers are laughing at us. I don't think they're laughing at us. I think they're laughing with us, because there's a sense of identification. I think so many, for example, in this book, there's a lot of comedy around and pathos, deep pathos around my father's decline and his sort of addiction with alcohol and gambling and whatnot. And one could say, oh, well, that's a very bad portrayal of a Muslim doctor or a Pakistani doctor. Why are you doing that? Well, or no, it's just a very human portrayal of a father and a son struggling to deal with a father who seems to be going off the tracks. It's an experience that a lot of people have. You don't have to be Muslim or Pakistani American or whatever to have that experience. Maybe many don't. I don't know, but I did, and so I want to be able to write about that. And I don't think at the end of the day, if my intention is to make, I often get this letter from people say, oh, you're a wonderful writer, but why aren't you using your gifts to make people want to come to Islam? I didn't know that was the goal. And I think it's a misunderstanding or a misapprehension about the nature of what literature is. I don't think, not to compare myself to too much to the great writers. Because I don't think I'm that great, but Tolstoy is not trying to make people look better. He's trying to show them as they are. And I think that's what gains you credibility as a writer. And what gains you credibility isn't writing positive portrayals. That's advertising. It's public relations. It's not art. So that's my response, but a lot of people don't like it.
I think it's a pretty decent and apt response. And going back to the question that Javed was asking and his commentary surrounding that question, nobody in the Jewish religious community issued a fatwa against Philip Roth or any of the other writers that.
But Shuja, there is a famous episode when Philip Roth's first book came out, Goodbye Columbus, and everybody said, "Oh my God, he's making us look terrible." And so then his mom called him and said, "Are you an anti-Semite, Philip?" And Philip said, "No, Mom, I'm Jew. We're Jewish. Of course, I'm not an anti-Semite." So then he went on the road and he went to he went to a bunch of different places, yeshivas, and he went to the Jewish Theological Seminary up on 123rd Street to do a talk with the community. And the rabbi who introduced him was in the very early 60s, got up and said, "In the Middle Ages, we would have known what to do with a Jew like this." That was his introduction. So it wasn't calling for an outright fatwa, but what he was saying is we would have had him excommunicated or we would have taken care of him. So there was that sentiment amongst the sort of post-war Jewish community about Philip Roth.
So now we're seeing a kind of growing up of the community if they accept what you write as art rather than as something that is betraying their heritage. I have another question, and for others who want to join this, please send your questions through the Q&A. They'll be relayed on to me. But this question, Ayad, is from Edward Levine, who says, as a playwright, you created narratives that were largely stripped of description, much as poetry strips its stories of anything that could possibly be extraneous. What moved you to turn to the novelist's craft, in which the temptation is to create mural-sized landscapes rather than spare verbal drawings?
Wow, what a question. That's an amazing question. And I think it's a very apt question. I mean, it's a very perceptive question for somebody who sort of has seen my work unfold over the last few years. I think that one way I could describe it is to say that there was a long period of extreme self-restraint, that the demands and the disciplines of writing plays require economy, concision, and the demand of telling a story through dialogue is a particularly it just demands a lot of you, a lot of sacrifice. You got to leave a lot on the cutting room floor. And I think that perhaps one of the sort of unconscious psychological motivations that went into the composition, the writing of this book was really being unleashed. 10 years of being so constrained by the form of plays, which I love, but are also incredibly demanding. They require you to strip away so much. I just felt the need, or I felt the ability to be free for the first time in a long time with language. And I would also say, I talk too much about Shakespeare. I know that it always gets me into some bit of trouble, just because critics think I'm trying to make myself look better, and audiences think that it must be boring if I'm going to talk about Shakespeare. But the fact is, I've spent so much of the last half decade immersed in Shakespeare that I think that part of this sort of mural-sized eloquence, if you will, or the aspiration to have that kind of large language that gets its arms around philosophical conundrums and many big experiences and emotions and ideas, comes from the discipline of reading so much Shakespeare. So to see firsthand what a writer who is, of course, much greater than any of us, but can accomplish with that kind of unrestrained freedom. So
I think another apt comparison might be to Mughal miniatures, which were often done with a single squirrel's hair and had depth as well as detail.
Yeah.
And yet, in terms of size, were not that big, but told a great story.
Yeah,
So
it's brilliant.
that's a good way of presenting it. Now, I do want to try and wrap up our conversation by having you read one segment, which you have in your book, and it's the uh, one that Shamila had, I think, referred to your conversation with
Nucci, yeah,
Nucci.
Nucci.
Oh, Nucci,
Yeah.
with Mary Maroney.
Yeah.
Yes. So on page 343,
Yeah.
You're asked this question as to why somebody like you is an American. I think that's the basic question.
So the context is that at the end of the book, I end up on a college campus. Mary Maroney is now teaching at a new university, and she's invited me to come. And the Muslim Student Union is very upset because they don't like a play that I wrote that they think makes Muslims look bad. But then the day before I arrive, there are all of these posters that go up on campus that are like the posters of Representative Ilhan Omar. And so then they become supportive. And so then there's an event at the end of the book where a local townie, somebody from the town, asks a question. He gets up at this event and he said, I heard about you on the radio and I thought I was going to come here and hear about all the problems in the Muslim world and why everything's so screwed up over there. But I just sat here for an hour and all you did was criticize America. If you don't like it, so that's the context. So during the Q&A that followed, an older white man stood up in the back row and explained that he'd come to the event having heard something about me on the radio. He'd expected to hear what he hoped would help him make better sense of the seemingly endless problems in the Muslim world. But here he was, and all he had heard was a lot of criticism of America. I mean, if you don't like it here, he said, I don't really understand why you don't just leave. There was sudden jeering from the students in the front row. I stopped them. The gentleman is free to ask a question. I'm free to give him an answer. I looked back at him. Where exactly, sir, were you thinking I might go instead? That part's not my problem. I'm just saying, I don't get why you're here if you think it's so darn hard. He sat down and waited for me to respond. It took a moment for me to speak. I didn't expect to be emotional, but I was. I saw Mary watching me, love in her eyes. When I finally spoke, my voice was unsteady. I'm here because I was born and raised here. This is where I've lived my whole life. For better, for worse, and it's always a bit of both. I don't want to be anywhere else. I've never even thought about it. America is my home.
Thank you. I think that captures it beautifully. And this is probably a good message to leave many of our fellow immigrants and fellow Muslims in America. They chose to be American, and having become American, they are going to be here. And that's something that the world will have to deal with, I suppose. So, let me now
I love that.
hand over to my colleague Fatima Salman from the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council. Ayad, I want to thank you again for spending this time with us. We could have gone on for an hour more, but time is limited, and I think Fatima would like to thank you also. So
great pleasure. Thank you, Shuja. Thank you so much for asking. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shuja, and thank you to the American Pakistan Foundation for co-sponsoring this event. And of course, thank you, Ayad. I felt that emotion at that last reading. And when I finished the book this weekend, I had to really ponder that last segment of the book. So thank you for that. What a beautiful discussion. And again, thank you for bringing so many of our stories to the forefront with your work, and to all the necessary corners in the homes that this book lives, and the dinner conversations that not only with, just the everyday white American families, but the Pakistani and immigrant American families, the Muslim Americans that will be talking about this book for years to come. It is so relevant to my own personal story as somebody in the diaspora, as a Muslim American. And to participants, please visit our website. And if you would like a copy of Homeland Elegies, I have it here. I was reading along with you guys as the excerpts were being read. Please visit ayadakhtar.com, where you can find where to purchase the book. And for participants, please visit our website for upcoming book talks with Shuja. Our upcoming one next month will be with Owit Bennett-Jones on his latest work, the Bhutto dynasty. So please do watch out for that email. Please visit our website. Stay tuned for more book talks with Shuja. And thank you again, Ayad. Thank you to the participants. Thank you to the American Pakistan Foundation for co-sponsoring.
Thank you.